Most women at some point encounter the invisible threads of emotional control. At first, they are so thin that they almost go unnoticed. A casual dismissal of her feelings, a quiet twisting of her memory, a subtle shift in tone that makes her question herself more than the man before her. These threads seem harmless, even ignorable. Yet over time, they weave a net around her sense of self. By the time she realizes she's trapped, the walls of doubt have already closed in. This is where the descent begins. A woman may walk into a relationship thinking she is choosing love, only to find she has walked into a labyrinth. The exit becomes harder to see because every corner bends her perception, every pathway distorts her reflection. Gaslighting, silence, sudden withdrawal, each tactic chips at her inner compass. She begins to ask, am I too sensitive, too demanding, not enough? These questions don't arise from truth, but from the manipulation of her reality. And the cruelest trick is this: the longer she doubts herself, the more control he gains. Carl Jung wrote of the shadow, the hidden parts of the psyche that are denied, repressed, or unacknowledged. In many men, this shadow takes the form of unprocessed insecurity, fear of inadequacy, or a desperate need for dominance. Instead of confronting their shadow, they project it onto the women closest to them. The woman becomes the mirror in which he sees his weakness, so he works tirelessly to break the mirror. What he cannot control within himself, he attempts to control outside himself. The result is not love, but possession disguised as care. For the woman caught in this dynamic, the effect is devastating. Her light, once radiant, begins to dim. She notices how her laughter feels forced, how her voice trembles before she speaks, how she edits herself in anticipation of his reaction. Slowly, she becomes a shadow of the woman she once was. This is no accident. It is the intended outcome of the subtle net woven around her. For if she no longer trusts herself, she will cling to the very hand that bound her. Yet hidden within her suffering, there is something he cannot touch. A quiet power that Jung described in the anima, the deep feminine energy within the psyche. Unlike the mask she wears for survival, this energy runs beneath the surface. It holds the memory of who she is, even when she forgets. It whispers truths when lies surround her. It waits for the moment she dares to listen again. Detachment begins here, not as indifference, not as coldness, but as a return to self. When a woman detaches, it is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is silent, invisible even to those around her. It begins with a single refusal, the refusal to let his chaos define her inner world. She stops arguing with distortions. She stops defending herself against false accusations. She stops searching for validation from a man incapable of giving it. Instead, she turns inward. Each act of quiet defiance is a thread of her own making, weaving a bridge back to her sovereignty. But detachment is not only a shield, it is also a mirror. When a woman withdraws her emotional investment, the man is confronted with the void of his own shadow. What he once filled with her energy is now left empty, and he feels the cold echo of himself. Some grow desperate, amplifying their tactics, pulling tighter on the invisible strings. Others unravel, for without her reflection, they no longer know who they are. This is the dangerous truth about female detachment. It is not passive, it is profoundly disruptive. Here lies the paradox. What he calls cruelty is her survival. What he calls distance is her clarity. And what he calls loss of love is the rebirth of her self-respect. Detachment is not an abandonment of feeling, but a reclamation of it. It is not the absence of love, but the refusal to pour it into a vessel that leaks. It is the quiet declaration that her soul will no longer be a playground for someone else's shadow. Yet the path toward detachment is rarely linear. There are moments of collapse when the net seems too tight to break. There are nights filled with doubt, mornings clouded by fear, afternoons where she considers surrendering to the familiarity of control. The mind plays tricks, whispering that pain is safer than freedom. The heart longs for what it remembers, not realizing that what it longs for never truly existed. This is the test. Can she endure the dissonance long enough to see beyond the illusion? Imagine her standing at the threshold of choice. Behind her lies the familiar labyrinth, dark and suffocating. Before her, the open unknown, terrifying yet full of possibility. The choice is not easy, for one path offers security in chains, the other freedom in uncertainty. But freedom asks for courage. And courage begins when she decides to trust the quiet voice inside, the one that has never stopped calling her home. The open loop begins here. A woman's detachment is often seen as the end of love. But what if it is, in fact, the beginning of something far more powerful? When a woman first feels the stirrings of detachment, it can feel like betrayal to her own heart. She may question if she has become cold, or if she has lost the ability to care. But this misunderstanding comes from years of conditioning that taught her love means sacrifice, patience, and the endless mending of broken bonds. In truth, detachment does not kill love, it purifies it. It separates genuine care from unhealthy entanglement, devotion from self-erasure. It is the point where compassion for another can coexist with loyalty to oneself. Jung's psychology reminds us that projection distorts relationships. A man who fears abandonment may accuse her of being distant, while it is his own shadow crying out in fear. A man who feels inadequate may belittle her accomplishments, disguising envy as criticism. Through projection, he unloads the weight of his unhealed wounds onto her. The danger is not that she believes his words, but that she begins to live as if they were true. Slowly, her world shrinks to fit his narrative, and the mirror of her identity reflects only his distortions. Detachment is the quiet refusal to carry what is not hers. It is the recognition that another person's shadow cannot be healed by self-sacrifice. No matter how much energy she gives, no matter how many times she bends, it will never be enough to fill a void that was not created by her. To detach is to step out of the role of savior and into the role of sovereign. She does not need to fix what he will not face. She does not need to soften the consequences of his denial. She allows him to meet his own shadow, even if he rages against the sight of it. The feminine archetype of the queen is central here. The queen does not beg for recognition, nor does she barter her worth for affection. She does not dissolve herself to soothe the insecurity of others. She rules her realm with grace, but her boundaries are fortified by wisdom. A man who enters her presence must meet her as an equal, not as a tyrant seeking control. When a woman begins to embody this archetype, her detachment becomes a throne from which she reigns. She no longer chases validation. She commands respect through the mere fact of her self-possession. But what makes detachment dangerous is not its power alone. It is the way it unmasks illusions. For the manipulator, her withdrawal is intolerable. He has built his identity upon the control of her emotional energy. Without it, he is confronted by silence that no longer bends to his will. The arguments once fueled by her defense now fall flat. The accusations once capable of piercing her now echo into emptiness. This absence of reaction is not weakness. It is an earthquake that crumbles the fragile scaffolding of his false authority. And yet, detachment is not cruelty. It is not an act of vengeance, nor an attempt to inflict pain. It is, rather, the refusal to be enslaved by someone else's chaos. To detach is to choose sanity over madness, clarity over confusion, peace over perpetual war. It is the discipline of no longer reacting to every provocation, the strength to walk away from endless cycles of blame and guilt. It is the moment a woman decides her life will no longer orbit around another's instability. Still, the inner battle can be fierce. She may miss the man she wished he was, rather than the man he revealed himself to be. She may mourn the imagined love, the dream she once believed in. Detachment requires her to face grief, not only for the relationship, but for the parts of herself she lost within it. She must acknowledge the years she silenced her voice, the moments she betrayed her intuition, the endless energy spent trying to be enough for someone who thrived on her doubt. In this morning, she begins to reclaim herself. Here enters the Stoic principle: control what is within your power, release what is not. His behavior, his shadows, his refusal to grow, these are beyond her control. But her response, her energy, her peace, these are hers to command. Detachment becomes the practice of returning her focus inward. Each time she resists the urge to defend, each time she chooses silence over battle, she reclaims a fragment of her sovereignty. These fragments gather, until one day, she realizes she has rebuilt the throne she thought she lost. And then a shift occurs. What once felt like coldness now feels like calm. What once felt like emptiness now feels like freedom. The very silence that terrified her becomes the sanctuary where she remembers her voice. In this space, she begins to see with new clarity. She recognizes the difference between love and control, between intimacy and enmeshment, between compassion and self-abandonment. Detachment was never the death of love, it was the rebirth of discernment. But discernment alone is not enough. It raises the question: once she has reclaimed herself, how will she choose to use this power? Will she retreat into isolation, fearing connection? Or will she step forward, carrying her sovereignty into every bond she forms? Detachment does not mean a woman withdraws from life or love altogether. It means she no longer confuses chaos with passion or control with intimacy. Once she steps out of the labyrinth of manipulation, she begins to see patterns with startling clarity. The arguments that once drained her now appear as rehearsed scripts. The guilt that once silenced her now feels foreign, as though it belongs to someone else. This shift is not simply intellectual, it is cellular. Her entire being starts to recalibrate toward truth. Jung often spoke of individuation, the process by which the self integrates its hidden parts and emerges whole. For the woman who has walked through distortion and chosen detachment, individuation begins with the recognition of her own shadow. She sees how her longing for love made her tolerate crumbs, how her fear of abandonment made her ignore red flags, how her empathy became a weakness when used against her. This is painful, but it is also liberating. For once she names these patterns, she is no longer bound by them. The danger of detachment for men who rely on control is that it removes the stage for their performance. Without her reactions, their tactics lose meaning. Gaslighting cannot survive when she no longer seeks external validation. Silent treatment cannot dominate when she finds comfort in her own company. Rage cannot destabilize when she refuses to absorb it. The energy he once consumed is returned to her, and with it, a new strength emerges. It is not loud, not dramatic, but steady and unshakable. This is where many women confront an unexpected truth. Detachment reveals not just the man's shadow, but also the woman's hidden strength. The one who thought she could not survive without him realizes she was always the source of her own stability. The one who believed she needed his approval discovers that her worth was never dependent on his gaze. The cage she thought locked was open all along. Her mind had only been trained to remain inside. But what if the cage was never locked? This question, sharp and piercing, interrupts the old rhythm. It unsettles the comfortable narrative of helplessness. It forces her to confront the possibility that freedom was always within reach, that the only barrier was the belief she could not walk away. In this realization, the entire architecture of control collapses, for no manipulation can bind a woman who has reclaimed her perception of reality. And so, detachment is not merely a withdrawal, it is an awakening. It is the recognition that peace does not depend on another's behavior, but on the boundaries she sets. It is the decision to no longer participate in cycles of chaos. It is the moment she steps out of the role of pawn and into the role of player, shaping her own life with deliberate intention. This awakening carries consequences. Men who thrived on her compliance may accuse her of being unloving, selfish, or cold. Friends conditioned by similar patterns may misunderstand her silence. Even family may pressure her to return to what feels familiar. But her detachment is no longer negotiable, for she has glimpsed the cost of living without it. She knows that without boundaries, love becomes servitude, and without discernment, compassion becomes a weapon used against her. In the language of archetypes, she transforms from the captive maiden into the queen who reigns. The maiden waits to be chosen, the queen chooses herself. The maiden doubts her voice, the queen speaks with clarity. The maiden gives without measure, the queen knows that her energy is sacred. This transformation does not make her untouchable, it makes her unbreakable. For even if love comes and goes, even if storms rise, her core remains sovereign. From this place, her relationships begin to change. She no longer attracts those who feed on her energy, for they sense she will not play their games. She begins to draw in those who meet her as equals, who are not threatened by her boundaries but respect them. Love, once entangled with power struggles, now becomes something freer, gentler, deeper. She is no longer searching for someone to complete her, for she has completed herself. And yet, the journey is not without challenge. Detachment must be maintained, not as a wall, but as a practice of self-awareness. It requires vigilance against slipping back into old patterns. It requires forgiveness of herself for the times she tolerated less than she deserved. It requires courage to face loneliness, not as emptiness, but as a sacred space of growth. Each day she chooses detachment, she strengthens the bridge back to herself, until one day she no longer fears losing anyone, because she has already found herself. But if detachment is an awakening, what comes after the awakening? What kind of life does a woman build once she is free from the labyrinth of control? After the awakening, a woman begins to live in a way that feels almost unrecognizable compared to her past. The noise of manipulation, the confusion of projection, the endless cycle of arguments, these no longer define her reality. Instead, her days are marked by a quieter strength. She trusts her intuition again, the same voice she once silenced under doubt. Every choice she makes becomes an act of alignment, a return to the rhythm of her true self. This is not just survival, it is the beginning of a new kind of life. In Jungian terms, this stage is integration. She is no longer split between the self that longs for love and the self that fears abandonment. She gathers the fragments of her shadow, the parts that once made her vulnerable, and weaves them into her wholeness. She acknowledges her need for connection, but also her need for autonomy. She honors her compassion, but also her capacity for boundaries. This integration makes her stronger than either extreme, for she is not bound to naivety, nor hardened by bitterness. She has become complete. What surprises her most is how others respond to this transformation. Some men, once eager to control, retreat in discomfort. They sense they cannot manipulate what no longer seeks their validation. Others who carry their own maturity are drawn to her presence, not because she bends to them, but because she does not. They see in her a mirror of their own capacity for depth. The dynamic shifts entirely, for she is no longer operating from fear. Her relationships become choices, not chains. The Stoics spoke of inner freedom as the only true freedom. External circumstances may change, people may come and go, but the sovereignty of the mind remains untouched. For a woman who has embraced detachment, this wisdom becomes lived truth. She no longer fears the loss of a relationship, for she knows she cannot lose herself again. She no longer dreads loneliness, for solitude has become her sanctuary, a place where she restores her energy and remembers her worth. What once felt like emptiness now feels like strength. This strength radiates in subtle but unmistakable ways. She speaks with calm, not urgency. She listens without absorbing poison. She moves through conflict with clarity, refusing to let another person's chaos dictate her emotions. This calm is not a mask. It is resilience born from experience. It is what Jung might describe as the emergence of the self, the deeper, unified center of the psyche. When a woman reaches this point, she no longer identifies with her wounds, nor does she hide from them. She carries them as part of her story, but not as her destiny. In many ways, detachment has given her something far greater than protection. It has given her vision. She can see through facades more quickly, sensing the difference between genuine connection and hidden agendas. She no longer ignores the tension between words and actions. Her intuition, once doubted, now speaks with authority. This clarity shields her better than any wall, for it allows her to step away before the threads of manipulation can even form. And yet this new life requires constant choice. Freedom is not a destination but a discipline. There will always be people who test her boundaries, who mistake her compassion for weakness. The difference now is that she recognizes these moments not as traps, but as opportunities to reaffirm her sovereignty. Each time she says no without guilt, each time she walks away without explanation, she strengthens the identity she has built. Over time, this becomes effortless, as natural as breathing. Her relationships now reflect her inner state. With friends, she cultivates bonds rooted in mutual respect. With lovers, she seeks reciprocity rather than rescue. With herself, she practices gentleness, no longer punishing herself for past mistakes. The woman who once doubted her worth has become the woman who embodies it. She no longer asks if she is enough. She knows she is, because her existence alone is sufficient. This is the ascent from shadow into sovereignty. What was once survival has transformed into mastery. She is no longer reactive to the chaos of others, nor does she need to prove her strength through struggle. Her strength is evident in her calm, her clarity, her refusal to betray herself again. Jung might say she has achieved individuation, the union of her conscious choices with her unconscious wisdom. She is whole, and wholeness is power. But this ascent raises a final, deeper question. Once a woman has embodied this sovereignty, how does she carry it into the world, not just for herself, but as a light for others who still wander the labyrinth? When a woman carries her sovereignty into the world, she becomes more than an individual healed from pain. She becomes an archetype in motion. Her presence alone shifts dynamics. Others feel her boundaries before she speaks them, as though the air around her is charged with quiet authority. She no longer has to explain why she will not tolerate disrespect. Her energy declares it without words. This is the dangerous truth of female detachment. It is not only self-preservation, but a signal to others that their games cannot reach her. Jung believed the unconscious of one person often activates the unconscious of another. When a woman embodies wholeness, she stirs something in those around her. Some may feel inspired, drawn toward their own growth. Others may feel threatened, confronted by their unhealed shadows. This is why such women often polarize responses, adored by those who respect themselves, rejected by those who seek control. Her detachment mirrors the unresolved wounds of others, and not everyone is ready to face such a mirror. But this mirror is her gift. For younger women still trapped in cycles of gaslighting and self-doubt, she becomes a living example of what is possible. They see in her not perfection but liberation. They notice her calm when others would panic, her refusal to chase when others would beg, her serenity where others would rage. In her presence, they glimpse their own potential to step out of the labyrinth. Without preaching, without instructing, she teaches by embodiment. Detachment, then, expands beyond the personal. It becomes a force of collective awakening. In a world that has long equated femininity with sacrifice, the detached woman reveals another path. Femininity as sovereignty, compassion balanced with discernment, love rooted in self-respect. This challenges cultural narratives that glorify endurance of pain as proof of devotion. It questions why women are told to fix what men refuse to confront. It dares to suggest that walking away can be an act of love, love for self, love for truth, love for life itself. The Stoics spoke of equanimity as the highest virtue, the ability to remain steady regardless of external chaos. This is what detachment offers her. When storms rise, she remains grounded. When accusations are hurled, she remains clear. When silence is used as punishment, she finds comfort in her own company. She is not unfeeling. She simply no longer allows another's volatility to dictate her state of being. This equanimity is her throne, and no one can dethrone her without her consent. Yet sovereignty does not mean isolation. The detached woman is not walled off from intimacy. On the contrary, her capacity for true connection deepens because she no longer fears losing herself in the process. She can give freely without calculation because she knows her boundaries will hold. She can receive love not as validation but as companionship. She can be vulnerable because vulnerability is no longer tied to dependency. In this balance, she redefines what love means. It is no longer about completing one another. It is about walking side by side, whole within themselves, yet stronger together. This redefinition is disruptive to old power structures. For men who thrived on compliance, her freedom feels dangerous. For families built on silence, her voice feels rebellious. For cultures that romanticize sacrifice, her sovereignty feels radical. Yet this disruption is necessary, for without it, the cycle of control repeats endlessly. Detachment is not the end of intimacy, it is the end of illusion. And when illusions end, transformation begins. Still, her journey carries one final task. Sovereignty must not harden into cynicism. Detachment must not transform into disconnection. For the greatest danger is not losing herself in another, it is closing her heart to the possibility of love altogether. The challenge, then, is to remain open but not unguarded, to remain compassionate but not self-erasing, to remain strong but not unreachable. This balance is not fixed, it is lived, adjusted moment by moment as life continues to unfold. Imagine the version of yourself who has already mastered this balance. She moves through the world with grace, her boundaries intact, her heart open, her vision clear. She is not seeking approval, for she has given it to herself. She is not clinging to illusions, for she lives in truth. She is not afraid of solitude, for she has befriended it. This version of you exists, not in some distant future, but in the choices you begin to make today. And so the open loop comes to its resolution. Detachment was never the end of love. It was the beginning of a love untainted by illusion. A love that includes yourself first, and from that fullness flows outward without fear. Share the moment you finally said enough and reclaimed your power in the comments below. The woman who sees the truth chooses her peace.